This month's podcast is a continuation from the last month. I was reading about the account of Dilip Kumar, his first meeting with Sri-Aurobindo. The name of the article he has given was A Radiant Personality. I continue. But must I necessarily be called upon to forego everything? Sri Aurobindo says, you may not be outwardly, that is, he said, but that won't make any very material difference, since your inner attitude has to be that of complete freedom all the same. The ideal must be nirliptata, non-attachment. If you can be truly non-attached within, you need not have to tear off the outward strappings of bondage. But remember that you must always be ready to shove aside anything that is incompatible with yoga. For that surely is one of its major conditions. Does that apply to things that do not, properly speaking, belong to the material plane, say music, which I love so dearly? Must I renounce that too? I haven't said you must. He smiled again indulgently. Only if yoga were the central thing in your life, you would not be so nervous at the prospect of having to give up music for its sake, would you? I hung my head discountenanced. I would not have you infer, I pleaded, that I couldn't possibly give up music, only I am not yet persuaded that yoga will make it up to me. My problem may be somewhat naive, but it is a problem nonetheless. It is like this. I don't find it hard to give up a lower thing for a higher one, provided I have some foretaste of the latter. But so long as I have no clear idea of what yoga has to give, why must I gamble away the tangible for the elusive? Before I burn my boats, can't I legitimately claim even a glimpse of what the deep has in store for me? Didn't I tell you just now that you need not necessarily give up your music or something just as tangible for that matter? What is obligatory is that should any activity or idea or habit or attachment or preoccupation prove an impediment on the way, you have to discard it when so required. But you haven't answered my question about the compensation. Or perhaps it is taboo to have such an intellectual curiosity or skepticism, if you will? Not quite. Only yoga, you must know, is not a matter of intellectual appraisement or recognition. It is essentially a matter of realization through self-dedication. As for your other question, surely the compensations of yoga are deep as well as abiding. Only you can't summon them to prove their validity before your mental dock. But let me tell you here that your difficulties aren't what you presume them to be. I mean, they are not mental at bottom. The truth of the matter is this: so long as the joys which belong to the lower planes continue to be too vividly real and covetable, you will find ready enough reasons why you shouldn't decline them. You can forego them only when you have had a call of the higher joys. When the lower ones begin to pall, sound hollow. The promised land of the spirit begins from the frontier of worldly enjoyments to start with. But why is it, I asked after a pause, that one can't expect to have even a glimpse beforehand of this land? Because of the thick walls of our worldly desires. Your premise here is not quite correct, he objected. For even when we live in the world of these desires, the glimpse, the call comes to us through chinks and rifts of dissatisfaction and surfeit. Only it doesn't last long until you are somewhat purified. For then only do you really begin to be open to it. The darkness returns intermittently after the light because it takes long to get our whole being open to the light. That is why yoga pushes us urgently upwards to altitudes where the light can be shut out no more by clouds. And it is just because yoga is such an ascent of consciousness that any attachment to or desire for lures and prizes on the lower planes, material, intellectual, or aesthetic, must eventually prove a shackle. Why then do you write so appreciatively of materialism as also of the intellectual and aesthetic delights? And why are your own writings so illuminating intellectually? Why have you praised art? Why write at all? The highest aim of the aesthetic being is to find the divine through beauty. Why not? Intellect, art, poetry, knowledge of matter, etc. can all help our progress appreciably, provided you direct them properly. It is at bottom a case of evolution. That is why I once wrote, reason was the helper, reason is the bar, which means simply that our intellect can be a help in our evolution only a part of the way. But when it presumes to judge what is beyond its domain, it must be put in its place. Besides, different recipients are differently constituted for different disciplines, seeking different fulfillments, each approaching truth in the way of his nature, svabhava. To put it in other words, those who are best recipients for the light of the intellect are mentally more evolved than those who are not so gifted intellectually. But that doesn't mean that there are no realizations higher than the mental ones. Assuredly there are. As we can concretely verify as we open ourselves to the realizations of the spirit, when we find the mental joys inadequate, the aesthetic joys no longer satisfying. With this opening, we glimpse worlds higher than those we have been used to. Do you follow? You mean that yoga enlarges our consciousness more and more? That is my view of evolution, he nodded. This gradual unfolding of the consciousness ascending to its higher reaches. And it is yoga which is to bring down further light and power in the next step of human evolution, the next stage of the evolution of human consciousness. I would read a small footnote at the end of the page. This is from the Life Divine. But first, it is well that we should recognize the enormous, the indispensable utility of the very brief period of rationalistic materialism through which humanity has been passing. For that vast field of evidence and experience which now begins to reopen its gates to us can only be safely entered when the intellect has been severely trained to a clear austerity. Seized on by unripe minds, it lends itself to the most perilous distortions and misleading imaginations, and actually, in the past, encrusted a real nucleus of truth with such an accretion of preventing superstitions and irrationalizing dogmas that all advance in true knowledge was rendered impossible. It became necessary for a time to make a clean sweep at once of the truth and its disguise in order that the road might be clear for a new departure and a surer advance. The rationalistic tendency of materialism has done mankind this great service. If modern materialism were simply an unintelligent acquiescence in the material life, the advance might be indefinitely delayed. But since its very soul is the search for knowledge, it will be unable to cry a halt as it reaches the barriers of sense knowledge and of the reasoning from sense knowledge. Its very rush will carry it beyond. Then I reverted to my difficulty. But what about my taking to yoga? Everybody can practice some yoga or other suited to his nature, he replied non-committally. But my question was about your integral yoga of self-surrender. Ah, he said slowly, as though weighing his words. About that I can't pronounce here and now. But why? Because the yoga that I have been pursuing of late, whose aim is the entire and radical transformation of the stuff and fabric of our consciousness, and being including our physical nature, is a very arduous one, fraught with grave perils at every step. In fact, so great are these dangers that I would not advise anybody to run them unless his call is so urgent that he is prepared to stake everything. In other words, I can accept only those with whom yoga has become such a necessity that nothing else seems worthwhile. In your case, it hasn't yet become so urgent. Your seeking is for some sort of partial elucidation of life's mysteries. This is at best an intellectual seeking, not an urgent need of the central being. Allow me to explain a little further, I said with a keen sense of disappointment, for I am afraid you haven't quite seen where the shoe pinches. I can assure you that mine is not merely a mental curiosity. I said seeking, not curiosity, he corrected. And I referred to the present only. I did not mean this could not develop later on into a real need of your central being.